The war had been raging for years, stretching across the galaxy like a never-ending storm. Sergeant Elias Moore had seen enough battlefields to last a lifetime. Every new fight, every new planet, it was all the same. The screams, the explosions, the chaos. But nothing could have prepared him for the day that would change everything. Elias had been sent to the planet Xerox 6, a rocky, desolate world caught in the crossfire of the intergalactic war between Earth and the alien Sulfar species. He and his unit were stationed there to protect Earth's interests and prevent the Sulfar from taking control of the planet. They weren't there for peace. They were there to fight, to win. The sun was setting over the dark, jagged mountains, casting long shadows across the battlefield. Elias crouched behind a boulder, trying to steady his breath. The sounds of distant gunfire and the hum of energy weapons filled the air. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his rifle tighter. War had a way of turning even the strongest soldiers into nervous wrecks. He wasn't afraid, not anymore, but that didn't make it any easier. Suddenly, there was a loud crack in the air, and a figure emerged from the smoke, a Sulfar warrior, tall and imposing, with thick green scales covering his body and glowing red eyes. The alien's armor was damaged, but he was still moving with deadly precision. Elias's heart skipped a beat. These Sulfar were no ordinary enemy. They were ruthless, skilled in combat, and terrifyingly strong. This one, Elias recognized, was Vornak, a legend among the Sulfar, known for his brutal efficiency on the battlefield. Vornak was the kind of enemy soldiers whispered about in fear, the kind of warrior who struck fear into anyone who dared face him. But now, as he limped forward, Elias noticed something different. There was no pride in Vornak's stance, no arrogance in his movements. He was injured. It wasn't just a minor wound either. The plasma blast that had hit Vornak had torn through his armor and left deep, smoldering burns on his body. His legs dragged behind him, barely able to support his weight. Yet he pushed forward, determined to fight, determined to survive. Elias's squad had orders: eliminate any Sulfar that crossed their path. But as he watched Vornak struggle, something inside him shifted. The instinct to fight, to kill, wasn't there. Instead, Elias felt a pang of sympathy. The Sulfar had always been the enemy. They had attacked Earth's colonies, killed countless humans, and brought chaos to every world they touched. But watching Vornak stumble, his face twisted in pain, Elias couldn't help but see him as more than just a monster. He was a warrior, a living being, just like him. And he was hurt. But it wasn't just that. The other Sulfar soldiers, seeing their comrade's weakness, had begun to retreat, leaving Vornak behind. They didn't even try to help him. They left him there, abandoned to die. That was when Elias knew what he had to do. The orders were clear: don't help the enemy. Don't show any weakness. But how could he leave a man, a soldier, behind just because he wore a different uniform? Elias had never been one for blind hatred. He wasn't a hero. He was just a soldier. But he believed in the code of honor. And right now, that code was telling him to help. "Sergeant Moore, what are you doing?" A voice crackled through his comm. It was Captain Marks, his commanding officer. Elias hesitated for a moment, then responded, his voice steady. "I'm going after him." There was a pause, then Marks barked. "Negative. Get back here. We have orders to move out. That Sulfar is a liability. Leave him." But Elias wasn't listening anymore. He lowered his rifle and began moving toward Vornak, who was now collapsed against a pile of rubble. Elias's boots crunched against the dirt as he approached, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of his decision. Every part of him knew it could cost him everything: his career, his reputation, maybe even his life. But he couldn't ignore it. Vornak, though weak, looked up as Elias drew near. His eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, flickered with confusion. For a moment, Elias thought the alien might attack. But instead, Vornak simply stared at him. There was no anger in his gaze, no hatred, just pain. "Please," Elias muttered under his breath. "I'm not going to leave you here." Elias knelt down beside Vornak, his fingers brushing against the alien's scorched skin. The Xalfar winced, but didn't flinch away. It was a strange moment, one filled with fear, yet also some unspoken understanding. The two warriors were enemies, yet here they were, sharing the same ground, both struggling to survive. Elias looked around. His squad had not followed him. They were back behind the cover, waiting for orders. He was on his own, but he wasn't alone, not anymore. Vornak needed him. "Can you walk?" Elias asked, his voice firm but kind. Vornak's response was a low growl, though it wasn't directed at Elias. The alien's strength had been drained, but his pride was still intact. He managed to push himself upright, leaning heavily on Elias. The two of them, one human and one alien, made an unlikely pair. As they moved through the smoke-filled battlefield, Elias could hear the sounds of the war closing in on them. The enemy forces were regrouping, but for now, it didn't matter. Elias focused on getting Vornak to safety, one step at a time. "Stay with me," Elias urged, even as his own fatigue began to set in. The adrenaline that had carried him this far was starting to wear off, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Vornak's deep, strained breaths echoed in the quiet moments between explosions, but despite the pain, the alien made no complaint. He simply followed Elias, his determination matching the soldier's own. As they moved deeper into the wreckage, Elias's mind raced. What would the others think? What would happen if they found out he was helping an enemy soldier? He could already hear Captain Marx's voice, furious, demanding answers. But Elias didn't care. He was doing what he thought was right. That was all that mattered. The journey wasn't easy. Every step forward was a struggle. Elias had to drive Vornak over rocks, carry him when he could no longer move, and shield him from incoming fire. But as the night dragged on, Elias realized something. This wasn't just about survival. It was about something bigger. Maybe it was about showing the universe that there was another way, a way to bridge the divide between enemies. By the time they reached the shelter, Elias was exhausted, barely able to stand. He collapsed against the cold stone wall, gasping for air. Vornak sat down beside him, his legs completely useless, his armor barely hanging on. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The only sound was the distant rumble of the battlefield. But in that moment of silence, Elias realized something. They had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something else. A new way forward, one where enemies didn't have to stay enemies forever. For now, though, Elias closed his eyes, hoping for rest. But the thoughts of what lay ahead weighed heavy on his mind. There was no going back. They had crossed a line, and nothing would ever be the same again. Elias could feel the weight of what he had just done. The moment he helped Vornak, everything changed. The war, his mission, the soldiers he fought alongside, all of it felt distant now. As he leaned against the cold stone wall of the shelter, trying to catch his breath, he couldn't help but replay what had just happened in his mind. He had broken rank, ignored orders, and risked everything to help an enemy soldier. But as he glanced over at Vornak, who was now resting against the wall, breathing heavily and still grimacing from the pain of his injuries, Elias didn't regret his decision. Not yet, at least. Vornak was an alien, a member of the Xalfar species, who had been at war with humanity for years. They had killed countless soldiers, destroyed colonies, and brought destruction to planets all over the galaxy. The Xalfar were brutal, and their warriors, like Vornak, were some of the fiercest fighters in existence. Yet, looking at Vornak now, Elias couldn't see the monster he was supposed to hate. He saw a soldier, wounded, vulnerable, and in need of help. It was as if all the hatred he had been taught, All the reasons to view the Xalfar as the enemy faded away in the face of this one alien warrior. For the first time in a long while, Elias questioned everything he had been taught about war. Was it really just about defeating the other side, no matter the cost? Or was there another way, a way to show mercy, even to an enemy? As the hours passed in the shelter, Elias couldn't help but think about the consequences. He had broken the rules. He had ignored his orders. Captain Marks, his commanding officer, would be furious when he found out. He might even be court-martialed. Elias wasn't sure if he would ever be allowed to wear the Earth military uniform again. But deep down, Elias felt something stronger than fear or regret. He felt a sense of rightness. He had done what he believed was the right thing to do. Sergeant Moore, Vornak's deep voice broke Elias's thoughts. The Xalfar spoke in broken English, but his words were clear. "You help me." Elias turned to face him. Despite the alien's injuries, there was a fierceness in his eyes that refused to show weakness. It was a look Elias knew well. It was the look of a soldier who would never give up, no matter how dire the situation. "I did," Elias replied quietly. "I couldn't leave you there." Vornak's expression softened, his glowing red eyes reflecting something Elias couldn't quite place. Gratitude. Respect. It was hard to tell. But Elias could feel the alien's appreciation, even if Vornak didn't say it directly. The silence between them grew heavy. Elias wanted to believe that helping Vornak was the right decision, but his mind kept replaying the consequences. What if the Xalfar found out? What if Captain Marks discovered what he had done? What if the rest of his unit turned on him for betraying them? As these thoughts ran through Elias's mind, the weight of the decision grew heavier. He had crossed a line. Helping an enemy soldier in the heat of battle wasn't just a small mistake. It was a risk that could cost him everything. "I could have let you die out there," Elias said, his voice filled with doubt. "I should have let you die. That's what the others would have done. But I couldn't." He shook his head. "I don't know what's right anymore." Vornak, despite his condition, let out a low growl, a sound that was somehow comforting. "You not let me die. You good. Human good." Elias chuckled softly. "I don't know about that, but I'm glad you think so." The Xalfar warrior gave a faint nod, his breathing labored but steady. Despite the pain, there was a sense of calm between them now. They were two soldiers from different worlds, united by a shared moment of survival. The war outside didn't matter right now. All that mattered was that they had made it this far together. But as the minutes stretched on, Elias could hear the distant rumble of the battle still raging outside. The war wasn't over. He had helped Vornak, but that didn't mean the rest of the Xalfar forces would simply let them escape. They would come searching for their fallen warrior, and Elias would be caught in the middle. His mind raced as he weighed his options. The shelter was safe for now, but it wouldn't be for long. The Xalfar would send patrols to find Vornak. If they discovered what Elias had done, they would likely kill him on the spot. Then there was his own unit. They had been left behind when Elias went after Vornak. It was only a matter of time before they realized he was missing. Captain Marks would want to know where he was, and Elias knew he couldn't just ignore his commander's orders forever. Elias let out a frustrated sigh. He didn't know what to do next. Helping Vornak had seemed like the right thing at the time. But now, the full weight of the consequences was sinking in. "Vornak," Elias said, his voice tense, "we can't stay here forever. We have to move, before the others come looking for us." Vornak blinked, then slowly nodded. "Where we go?" Elias rubbed his temples, trying to think. The nearest safe zone was Scar Outpost, a rebel base where survivors from both human and alien factions had gathered to fight against the common enemy. But reaching the outpost wouldn't be easy. They would have to cross miles of enemy territory, dodge patrols, and navigate through the heart of the war zone. Elias had no illusions about the danger they faced. The Xalfar weren't known for showing mercy to their own, let alone to an enemy. Vornak was a high-ranking warrior, and Elias had just saved him from certain death. The Xalfar wouldn't forgive that. But what choice did they have? If we're going to make it, Elias said, glancing at Vornak, we'll have to stick together. We can't afford to get separated, and we can't waste time. I'll help you, but you have to trust me. Vornak's glowing eyes locked onto Elias's, and for a brief moment, Elias could see something in them. Something that told him the alien warrior had no choice but to trust him too. His life was in Elias's hands now, just as much as Elias's life was in his. Vornak's response was simple but meaningful. I trust you. The words weren't just a statement. They were a bond forged in the heat of battle. They were soldiers, not enemies. Elias could feel the weight of that trust, and he knew that, no matter what happened, he couldn't betray it. I'll get you to Scar Outpost, Elias said, determination filling his voice. But we need to move now. The longer we wait, the more likely we are to get caught. Vornak nodded, gritting his teeth against the pain in his legs. Lead the way. As Elias helped Vornak to his feet, the gravity of the situation settled over him. They were leaving behind the safety of the shelter, stepping back into the heart of the war zone. It was dangerous, reckless even, but there was no turning back. They were in this together now. Two soldiers from opposite sides of a war, united by something stronger than orders, something deeper than duty. As they made their way through the shattered landscape, Elias couldn't help but wonder if, somewhere in the future, their alliance could change the course of the war. If humans and Xalfar could find a way to work together, perhaps there was hope for peace after all. But right now, all that mattered was survival. And so, with the war raging around them, Elias and Vornak began their dangerous journey into the unknown. The journey out of the battlefield was harder than Elias had imagined. It wasn't just the physical toll of carrying Vornak, who, despite his strength, was still injured and barely able to move. It was the weight of what he had done. Every step he took felt like a step further into unknown territory. Elias was breaking every rule he had ever been taught. Soldiers followed orders. They didn't help enemies, no matter how badly wounded they were. The Xalfar were the enemy, and it didn't matter how human or alien they were. Killing them was part of the job. But now, Elias was walking side by side with one of the fiercest enemies humanity had ever faced. Vornak, though injured, was still a warrior. His strength radiated through every movement he made, even as he leaned on Elias for support. His pride was still intact, his face set in determination. As they moved through the barren land of Xerox 6, Elias couldn't shake the strange feeling that had been growing since he decided to help Vornak. The weight of his choice hung on him like a storm cloud, and he couldn't escape the nagging thought. What now? Vornak's alien body was tough, but his injuries were serious. Elias had managed to slow the bleeding, but the Xalfar's scales had been scorched by the plasma blast, leaving deep burns that would take time to heal, time they didn't have. They stopped briefly near a crumbled building for some water, and Elias couldn't help but glance over at the alien warrior. Vornak's breathing was labored, but his eyes were sharp, watching their surroundings carefully. Despite the pain, he was alert, not willing to give up. "Are you okay?" Elias asked, his voice quiet. Vornak gave him a small nod. "I am fine. We go." Elias smiled faintly. "We'll get there. I won't leave you behind." For a moment, there was a strange stillness between them. Vornak's glowing red eyes met Elias's, and there was an unspoken understanding between the two soldiers. They had fought each other before, they had been enemies, but now they were something else. They were two beings from different worlds, bound together by the need to survive. As Elias helped Vornak continue walking, the thought occurred to him. What was it that brought him to this point? He had made a choice, but it wasn't just about mercy. Something deeper was at play. The bond they were forming wasn't based on need alone. There was something else. Respect, maybe. The more time he spent with Vornak, the more he realized the alien was not just a killer. The Xalfar might be ruthless in battle, but Vornak wasn't the monster Elias had always imagined. He was a warrior, a proud warrior who had his own code of honor. That much was clear. Despite being abandoned by his own kind, Vornak wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. There was no hatred in his eyes. The silence between them grew, and Elias found himself wondering if this was the start of something bigger than just their own survival. Could there be a way to work together, even as enemies? Could the human and Salfar species ever come to some kind of understanding? Vornak, Elias began, unsure of how to phrase his thoughts. You're different than what I thought. You're not what I expected. The alien warrior looked at him, and Elias saw something flash across his face, something almost like amusement. Different. All Xalfar are same. We fight. We survive. I used to think all of you were just monsters, that you didn't care about anything except killing, Elias said, shifting his weight and glancing around the barren landscape. But you're not like that, are you? Vornak was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke, his voice steady but tinged with something hard to place. I fight for honor. For my people. We all have purpose. Elias looked at him, trying to make sense of the words. Purpose. Vornak's expression was hard to read. He stared at the horizon, and for a moment, Elias wondered if the warrior was remembering something from his past. Purpose is not always clear, but it is what drives us. We fight to protect, not just to kill. Elias could hear the truth in those words, and they surprised him. He had always believed that the Xalfar were mindless, bloodthirsty creatures. But here, with Vornak, he was beginning to see a different side. A side that made sense. It made Elias question his own beliefs. What do you want? Elias asked, trying to understand more about the alien warrior. Vornak didn't answer right away. His gaze turned inward, as if contemplating the question. I want to survive, he said finally, his voice softer than before. I want to live, not just to fight. Elias couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy. Here was a creature who had been taught his entire life to fight, to kill, to survive. And now, in this moment of weakness, he wanted the same thing Elias did. Peace, rest, a chance to live without the constant need to fight. I get that, Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. I get that more than you know. Vornak glanced at him, a flash of understanding passing between them. Humans fight, too. Vornak asked, his voice low, but curious. Elias nodded. We fight for survival. We fight to protect the people we love. But sometimes it feels like we're always fighting, you know. Always on the edge of something terrible. I understand, Vornak replied, his voice thoughtful. I thought only Xalfar understood this. Elias chuckled. No, we understand it too. The quiet moments that followed were strange, almost peaceful, despite the war raging outside. Elias helped Vornak as they moved forward, step by step. Each foot they took brought them closer to Scar Outpost, but each step also brought them closer to understanding each other. The bond between them was unlikely, human and alien, soldier and enemy, but it was real. There was a connection forming, one that neither could ignore. As they walked through the night, they had no clear plan, no certainty that they would even make it to the outpost. But what they did have was trust, something that transcended species, something that Elias had never expected to find in an enemy. Eventually, they reached a small grove of trees, a temporary shelter from the open field. They were both exhausted, and it was clear that they needed to rest before continuing their journey. Elias helped Vornak to the ground, careful not to jostle him too much. The alien warrior's wounds were still causing him pain, but he didn't complain. For a while, the two of them simply sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. It was strange, this quiet between them. They were two enemies who had shared countless battles, and now they were allies. Unlikely, yet undeniable. Vornak, Elias said, breaking the silence. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if we'll make it, but I want you to know. I didn't do this to be a hero. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Vornak nodded slowly. You do what is right. You do not care what others think. This is what makes you different. Elias shook his head. No, I care. I care about what happens next. I care about the future. I don't know if there's hope for peace. I don't know if we can ever stop this war. Vornak's eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, locked onto Elias. Hope is not given. Hope is fought for. You and I, we fight for hope. Elias smiled, a small, tired smile. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope inside him. It wasn't a big flame. It wasn't even a spark yet, but it was something. I think you're right, Elias said quietly. We fight for hope. As they sat there, under the stars of Xerox 6, two soldiers, one human, one alien, shared the quiet bond of unlikely allies. They didn't know what the future would hold, but they had each other for this moment. And that, Elias thought, was a start. The quiet between them was broken by the distant rumble of the battle. The war still raged on in the distance, like an ever-present storm that couldn't be ignored. Elias and Vornak sat in the small grove, taking shelter from the open fields, but they both knew that their time there was limited. They couldn't stay where they were forever. The Xalfar would be searching for Vornak, and it was only a matter of time before enemy patrols came sweeping through the area. Elias glanced at the alien warrior, his mind racing. They couldn't afford to wait too long. With every passing minute, they were getting closer to being discovered. Vornak, Elias said, breaking the silence, his voice low, we need a plan. If we don't move soon, we'll be caught. The Xalfar won't stop hunting you, and we can't stay here much longer. We have to reach Scar Outpost. It's our best shot at surviving. Vornak's red, glowing eyes met his, and for a moment, Elias thought he saw a flicker of doubt in the alien's gaze. It was the first time he'd seen anything resembling hesitation from Vornak. But the Xalfar warrior didn't speak for a long time. Instead, he studied their surroundings with quiet intensity, his sharp senses on high alert. Outpost is far, Vornak finally said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his words. We will need cover. We cannot walk in open ground. Xalfar patrols are everywhere. Elias nodded, understanding. He had been in enough battle zones to know how dangerous it could be to try to cross enemy territory. The Xalfar had no mercy for their own soldiers, let alone humans. If they were spotted, they wouldn't hesitate to kill them both. I agree, Elias said, tapping his finger against his chin as he thought. We'll have to stick to the cover of the forest as much as we can. It's the only way we can avoid being seen. Vornak seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding slowly. Forest is good, but we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the closer we are to being trapped. Elias glanced around, his eyes scanning the area. The small grove they were in offered some protection, but it wasn't enough. They needed to get moving. He knew that if they didn't make it to Scar Outpost soon, they would be trapped, and the war would catch up with them. I've been thinking about that, Elias said. We can't just walk straight into the outpost. It's surrounded by enemy lines, and there's no way to get past without a plan. We'll need a diversion to distract the patrols. That'll give us a window of time to slip through. Vornak raised an eyebrow. Diversion. Elias nodded. Yes, we can create a distraction in the north. There's a small supply depot there. If we set it on fire, it will draw the Xalfar patrols away from our path. While they're dealing with the fire, we'll move south. It's risky, but it's the only chance we have. Vornak seemed to consider this for a moment, his gaze narrowing as he thought it through. You think fire will fool them? It's the best we've got, Elias replied. We'll need to be quick. If we don't get far enough before they realize what happened, we'll be in trouble. The alien warrior nodded slowly, clearly weighing the risks. But Elias could see the same determination in Vornak's eyes that had been there since the moment he'd helped him on the battlefield. They had no choice but to trust each other now. "We do this," Vornak said, his voice steady, his decision clear. Elias felt a surge of relief. At least they were on the same page now. "All right, we'll leave at first light. That'll give us the cover of darkness to move faster, but we need to rest for a while. We can't move on empty strength." Vornak grunted in agreement and settled down against a nearby tree. Elias, though exhausted, knew that they had little time to sleep. Every minute they wasted was another minute closer to being discovered. They needed to be sharp, and they needed to stick together. The night passed slowly. Every rustle of the wind, every snap of a branch in the distance made Elias's heart race. He couldn't help but wonder what was waiting for them outside the safety of the grove. Would the Xalfar be waiting in the shadows? Would their plan even work? As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, Elias and Vornak were ready. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. They packed up what little gear they had, making sure not to make too much noise. The last thing they wanted was to alert any nearby patrols. "We move fast," Elias whispered to Vornak. "Stay close and keep quiet. Don't make any unnecessary noise." Vornak gave a quick nod, his face hardening into an expression of focus. They were both fully aware that the danger they were walking into was very real. The moment they left the cover of the trees, they would be exposed. But if they could make it to the supply depot, they would have a chance. They moved in silence, staying low to the ground as they navigated through the dense forest. The thick underbrush made it difficult to see very far ahead, but it also gave them some much-needed cover. Elias kept his eyes trained on the ground, watching for any signs of movement. Every step felt like a risk, but with Vornak by his side, he felt a strange sense of confidence. They reached the edge of the forest as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting more light on the open fields ahead. From here, Elias could see the faint outline of the supply depot in the distance. It was a small, fortified structure, surrounded by guards and a few Xalfar patrols. It wasn't heavily guarded, but that didn't mean it would be easy to reach. "All right," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to create a distraction. I'll set the fire. You keep watch. If anyone comes close, we'll have to deal with them quickly." Vornak nodded again, his red eyes scanning the area as he crouched low to the ground. "Understood." Elias moved forward cautiously, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. He knew the fire would draw attention, and once it started, there would be no turning back. He reached the supply depot and quickly located a stack of crates filled with flammable materials. A few well-placed shots from his plasma pistol would be enough to set it all alight. With a deep breath, Elias took aim and fired. The crates exploded in a burst of flames, sending smoke and sparks into the air. The fire quickly spread, and within seconds, the depot was ablaze. Elias could hear the sounds of Xalfar soldiers shouting and running toward the flames. "Now," he hissed to Vornak, who was already moving, staying low and quick. They dashed toward the southern edge of the depot, where the smoke would provide some cover. As they made their way through the smoke, Elias's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The diversion had worked. The Xalfar were distracted, and they had a small window of time to slip past the patrols. But the danger wasn't over. The fire would only keep the enemy occupied for so long. They had to move quickly. Elias and Vornak sprinted through the smoke, darting from tree to tree for cover. Every step felt like a race against time. They could hear the sounds of chaos behind them. The shouts of the Xalfar soldiers, the crackling of the fire. They had made it this far, but there was still a long way to go. They kept moving, never stopping, never looking back. The road to Scar Outpost was still far, and the path was fraught with danger, but for the first time in a long time, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The plan was working, and with Vornak at his side, Elias knew they had a fighting chance. The sun had risen fully by the time Elias and Vornak reached the outskirts of the forest. The thick trees and underbrush had provided them with cover, but now they were exposed to the wide open fields ahead. The supply depot had worked as a perfect diversion, but it had also bought them only a small window of time. They were far from safety, and the real trial of their escape was just beginning. Elias's heart pounded as they moved cautiously forward. His mind raced, constantly reminding him of the stakes. If they failed now, everything they had done would be for nothing. They still had to cross several miles of open ground before reaching Scar Outpost. It wasn't going to be easy. The Xalfar would be on high alert now, and if they were spotted, they wouldn't get another chance. Vornak, despite his injuries, moved with the agility of a seasoned warrior. His pace was steady, and his sharp eyes scanned the terrain with practiced precision. Elias was amazed at how well Vornak had adapted to the situation. The alien was clearly no stranger to danger, and in some ways, Elias felt like he was learning from him. There was a silent understanding between them now, a mutual respect forged in the heat of battle. "We can't stay out in the open for long," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "If we're spotted, we won't be able to outrun them." Vornak nodded. His expression was hard, but there was something about it that reminded Elias of a warrior preparing for battle. The determination in his eyes was unmistakable. "Xalfar patrols are close," Vornak said in a low voice, "but we have time. We will move when it is safe." Elias glanced around. The field they were in was vast, and the cover was scarce. There were small patches of grass and rocky outcrops, but nothing that would give them the full protection they needed. Their best chance was to keep moving and stay low to the ground. They crouched low, moving as silently as possible, each step measured and careful. The sound of distant footsteps and faint voices echoed from the edge of the field. Xalfar patrols were getting closer. Elias could hear their deep, guttural voices as they discussed the fire they had set at the supply depot. The distraction had worked, but now it seemed like the Xalfar were more determined than ever to find whoever was responsible. "Just a little longer," Elias muttered under his breath, urging himself to stay calm. Vornak held up a hand, signaling for Elias to stop. The alien warrior's ears twitched, his senses attuned to every sound. Elias's breath caught in his throat as he watched Vornak's eyes narrow in concentration. The distant voices grew louder. The patrol was coming in their direction. Elias could see the silhouettes of Xalfar soldiers in the distance, moving slowly through the field, their weapons drawn. They were scanning the area, looking for any sign of the intruders. If they were spotted now, it would be over. Elias's heart raced, and his fingers gripped the handle of his plasma pistol. He wasn't sure what they would do if they were discovered. He and Vornak were outnumbered, and in open ground, there was no cover to hide behind. "Stay low," Vornak whispered, crouching even lower to the ground. Elias followed his lead, pressing himself against the earth as much as he could. The grass around them was tall enough to provide some concealment, but it wouldn't protect them for long. The Xalfar soldiers moved closer, their heavy boots crushing the grass beneath them. Elias could hear their breath, their weapons shifting in their hands. Each step felt like an eternity. He could feel the tension building in his chest, the fear creeping up his spine. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to run, but he knew that running would only make things worse. They had to stay hidden. If they moved too soon, they'd be caught. Vornak was still watching them, his red eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. Elias couldn't help but notice the calm determination on the alien's face. Despite the danger, Vornak seemed unshaken. It was as though the warrior had faced moments like this before. Elias envied that kind of calm. The patrols passed by within a few feet of them, but they didn't stop. Elias's breath was held tightly in his chest, and he could feel the sweat on his brow. Time seemed to stretch on forever as the Xalfar soldiers moved past them, unaware of the two fugitives lying in the grass. When the last of the patrol had passed, Vornak gave a slight nod. Elias exhaled sharply, feeling the weight of the moment finally lift. They had survived this round, but they couldn't afford to get too comfortable. There was still a long way to go. Vornak moved first, staying low to the ground as he silently signaled to Elias to follow. Elias nodded, pushing himself to his feet as quietly as he could. They were moving again, and the danger was far from over. For the next few hours, they continued to make their way across the open field. They took cover whenever they could, staying in the shadows and moving only when the patrols were far enough away. Elias's legs were burning with exhaustion, but he knew they couldn't stop. Not yet. Eventually, the edge of the field was in sight. The open ground would soon give way to the safety of the hills surrounding Scar Outpost. But even as the distant silhouette of the outpost loomed on the horizon, Elias knew that they weren't safe yet. The hardest part was still ahead. "We're close," Elias whispered, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "But it's not over. We still have to get past the outpost defenses." Vornak nodded. "Outpost is guarded. We need to find a way inside without being detected." Elias's mind raced. The outpost was heavily fortified, with armed guards patrolling the perimeter. It was surrounded by high walls and security checkpoints. There was no way they could simply walk in. They had to find a way to bypass the defenses or risk being caught. As they drew closer to the outpost, Elias began to formulate a plan. He had seen the security setup from a distance when he'd arrived earlier. There was a section of the wall that wasn't as heavily guarded, an old breach from a previous battle. If they could make it there undetected, they might have a chance to slip inside. "We'll head for the breach," Elias said, his voice firm. "It's our best shot. We can't waste any more time." Vornak looked at him, his red eyes gleaming in the light. "Lead the way." They moved quickly now, not pausing to rest. Each step was calculated, and every moment felt like it could be their last. Elias could hear the sound of guards' footsteps echoing from behind the walls, and he knew they had to hurry. When they reached the breach in the wall, Elias signaled for Vornak to stop. They crouched low to the ground, keeping out of sight. Elias scanned the area carefully, looking for any signs of movement. The breach was narrow, but it would give them enough room to squeeze through if they were careful. "We go now," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. Vornak nodded, and the two of them moved toward the breach. The ground beneath their feet felt uneven, and Elias's heart was pounding in his chest. They were so close to the safety of the outpost, but they still had to get through the wall undetected. Elias squeezed through first, taking a deep breath as he made it to the other side. Vornak followed quickly behind, and they both ducked low to avoid being seen by any guards on the other side. They were inside. For a moment, neither of them moved. They listened carefully, their ears straining for the sound of approaching footsteps. When they were sure the coast was clear, they slowly made their way deeper into the outpost. But just as Elias thought they were in the clear, a voice rang out from behind them. "Stop!" The final trial had begun. The sharp, commanding voice echoed across the dimly lit halls of Scar Outpost. Elias's heart skipped a beat as he turned quickly, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. He had no idea how much time they had left before the guards caught up with them. Their entire escape had been nothing short of a miracle so far, but the real challenge was still ahead. "Stop!" the voice called again, growing closer. Elias and Vornak had only moments to act before their cover was blown. The thought of getting captured now, after everything they had fought for, was unbearable. Elias's eyes darted around, searching for any possible escape route. The walls of the outpost were high and reinforced, but there had to be a way out of this. His mind raced, calculating the options available to them. "Vornak," Elias whispered urgently, his voice barely above a breath. "We need to move fast." The alien warrior's eyes glowed faintly, and for a moment he seemed to consider the situation. Despite being severely injured, Vornak's instincts were razor-sharp, and his strength and resolve were unshaken. There was no hesitation in his eyes. "Move," Vornak grunted. Elias barely had time to react before the loud footfalls of Sulfar soldiers filled the hallway. His mind screamed at him to think quickly. He couldn't let them get caught. They were so close to safety. If they failed now, everything would be lost. Without thinking, Elias grabbed Vornak's arm and pulled him toward a side corridor. It was narrow, and it seemed to go deeper into the heart of the outpost, but it was the only way they could avoid the incoming guards. They couldn't afford to be cornered. They had no backup, no more tricks up their sleeves. They had to rely on their speed and their will to survive. The corridor was eerily quiet, the only sound the rush of their footsteps echoing in the confined space. Elias could feel his pulse racing, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready to spring into action if needed. He glanced at Vornak, whose face remained impassive, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow for signs of danger. It was clear that the alien warrior was still operating at full capacity, even with the injury he had sustained. "We can't go back," Elias muttered, his voice tight. "This is our only way forward." Vornak gave a slight nod, acknowledging the gravity of the situation. "Agreed," he said in his usual calm, steady tone. "We must reach the command center. Only there will we find the answers we need." The command center. Elias had heard of it, a highly secured room in the heart of Scar Outpost. It was where the highest-ranking officers of the Sulfar made their decisions, where military strategies were formulated and carried out. If they could reach it, they might be able to find a way to end the war, or at least cripple the Sulfar's control over the region. But the path to the command center would be anything but easy. There were armed guards, surveillance systems, and heavily fortified doors. "We'll have to move carefully," Elias said, his voice almost a whisper now. "One wrong move, and it's over." Vornak said nothing, but his steady gaze spoke volumes. He understood the risks. They both knew the stakes. They had come this far, and now there was no turning back. They had to take this final step, no matter the cost. The outpost was a maze of narrow corridors and long hallways, all designed to confuse and disorient intruders. Elias had spent enough time in military facilities to know how these places worked. The walls were thick, and the doors were reinforced. There were security cameras at regular intervals, and the air was thick with the tension of an impending fight. Elias was familiar with the pressure, the sense that at any moment, everything could come crashing down. As they moved through the outpost corridors, Elias's mind whirred with thoughts of what was at stake. What if they failed? What if the Sulfar captured them? What if the entire mission fell apart? But there was no time for doubt. They had come too far to turn back now. "Stay low," Elias whispered, as they approached a junction. He motioned for Vornak to follow him, careful not to make a sound. They crouched behind a corner and waited, holding their breath as they listened for any signs of movement. The silence was broken only by the soft hum of the outpost's ventilation system. Elias strained his ears, his eyes scanning the shadows, waiting for the right moment. They waited for what felt like an eternity before the sound of footsteps reached their ears. It wasn't just one guard. There were several. They were getting closer. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he weighed their options. They could wait for the guards to pass, but the risk of being caught was too high. If they stayed here much longer, they would be trapped. Vornak shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. With a quick motion, the alien warrior signaled Elias to follow him. They didn't have time to wait. They had to act now. Elias nodded in understanding and followed Vornak as the alien silently moved forward, his every step calculated, his body a blur of motion. Elias kept low, staying close to Vornak as they moved deeper into the outpost bowels. They were close to their target now, but the danger was still ever present. The sound of approaching guards grew louder. Elias's pulse quickened. He could hear the faint clicking of boots on the metal floors, the faint hum of the outpost's security systems in the background. This was it. They had to act now. With a sudden, swift motion, Vornak drew his weapon and fired. The Salfar guards didn't stand a chance. Elias barely had time to process what had happened before they were moving again, darting through the hallway and around the corner, further into the depths of the outpost. "Keep moving," Vornak ordered, his voice a low growl. They pushed forward, navigating the maze of the outpost halls with a newfound urgency. Every second felt like a lifetime. They were so close now. But even as they drew nearer to their goal, Elias knew the hardest part was still to come. Finally, they arrived at a heavy security door, the entrance to the command center. This was it, the final obstacle. The door was reinforced, its surface gleaming with the telltale signs of high-tech security. It would take more than just a few blasts to break through. They would need a plan. Elias looked at Vornak, who was already scanning the area for any weaknesses. The alien warrior's mind was sharp, calculating, and Elias trusted him completely. The two of them worked together without speaking, each knowing what the other needed. Vornak approached the security system and worked quickly, his alien hands moving with practiced precision. Elias kept watch, his eyes darting to every corner, every shadow, every sound. They had no room for error. "Almost there," Vornak muttered, his voice steady but tense. Elias nodded. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. If they failed now, there would be no second chance. The door opened with a soft click, and for a brief moment, Elias felt a surge of relief. But the job wasn't finished. They still had to get past the guards inside and complete their mission. "Ready?" Elias whispered, his heart racing. Vornak gave a small nod. "Let's finish this." The two of them entered the command center, moving silently through the high-tech facility. The room was filled with consoles and communication devices, buzzing with activity. At the center, a group of high-ranking Salfar officers were gathered around a central table, discussing their plans. They hadn't noticed Elias and Vornak yet. The two of them moved quickly, taking out the guards silently, their movements quick and efficient. They didn't have time to waste. Every second mattered. As Elias approached the central control panel, his hand shaking slightly, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of purpose. They were close to ending this, close to securing a new dawn for both humanity and the alien world that had been ravaged by war. He activated the console, and a series of screens flickered to life. The mission was almost complete. Elias could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had no idea what would come next, but one thing was clear: they had changed the course of history.